Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. We're just a few weeks away from the conclusion of our 2011 matching campaign fund. We are trying to raise $200,000 by the end of December, and we must do so if there's going to be real news in 2012. And thanks to support from people like you, one of the most important fronts of our work has been in the Middle East. Lia Tarachansky has been covering things for us from Palestine and Israel since 2009, and she joins us now to talk about her work. Thanks for joining us, Lia.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
So, since the last time we interviewed you, it's almost a year's gone by. Talk a little bit about what are the most important stories you've covered, and a little bit about what's happening now.
Well, we've been continuing two of our main series. One is looking at who benefits from the occupation, and some of the recent stories that have done in that really look at the system of segregation in the West Bank. Another series that we were working on is Impunity, Israel, and International Law. And I've done a couple of stories on that. For example, the bombing of Gaza following the terror attack that happened in southern Israel. But there's also two new things that we've sort of ventured out into in our coverage from here. One of it has got a lot to do with geopolitics. So one of the last stories I did was talking about the internal Israeli debate between the leadership and the security establishment about whether or not to attack Iran. And another one of the stories that I did in that regard had to do with the prisoner exchange deal, the Gilad Shalit deal, that had a lot to do with geopolitics, changing so fast here in the Middle East. And a new thing that we started was covering the Israeli summer. It was called the Israeli summer, or the J14 movement for July 14, which was an Arab Spring style movement that started here in the summer in Israel and swept the country in the biggest protests the country's ever seen. There were 10 cities everywhere, and we were on the ground covering them intensely. Also looking at some of the things that some of the local media was not looking at, such as discrepancies between the fights inside of Israel between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, the economic disparities inside Israel. And we were actually the first foreign press agency to cover this protest for the foreign audience.
Well, talk a bit about that. How do you think working at and reporting for the Real News Network and the sort of angle you're able to take, the environment you work in editorially, how does that affect what you do, and how would you compare that to what you see in mainstream coverage of the same kinds of issues?
Sure. Well, because we are based here on the ground, while most mainstream foreign media actually just sends people here, we were able to get a lot of the nuances and a lot of the context behind why people were on the streets. And also because we're editorially independent, we could ask some of the questions that some of the other networks were not asking, such as, for example, while the country was waking up to a protest that was supported by almost 80% of the population, and we saw people on the streets like we've never seen in this country before, nobody was talking about, for example, even the Palestinian citizens of Israel, let alone the Palestinians in the occupation. So we did a number of stories about the absence of equality within the movement itself, and the fact that the movement was very adamant about not wanting to address some of those issues. And we've sort of followed the movement along. So one of the other things that we do a lot in the Real News is context. And we've been here with this movement since the very beginning until now, covering it very closely, watching it evolve and move forward.
Well, if you look at American mainstream coverage of Israel, it's almost without any kind of criticism at all. And I know from having worked in these kinds of newsrooms, mainstream newsrooms, that there's quite a lot of pressure brought to bear. How does that affect you? And people that have watched your earlier story, the interview we did with you, know you grew up in Israel. You actually grew up in a settler town. So there's, here there's kind of external pressures on media, but there must be some internal pressures or family even pressures on you. So talk a bit about this.
Well, from many conversations, both with foreign journalists here and Israeli journalists here, I find that the majority of the problem is not actually censorship from the newsroom, but self-censorship. Journalists being afraid to talk about many of the real issues that are the biggest issues here. People who are afraid to talk about the occupation or calling it the occupation for the consequences. They're afraid to see to their career and to see to their stories. So because we're independent, that means that I don't have to face that kind of self-censorship. And if the story is evidence-based, then I pretty much have almost complete freedom.
Okay, well, we're going to go now to an example of one of Lia's stories. And we hope, as you're watching this, maybe you'll also click donate at the Real News Network. And if there's a place on the donation page, you can even pick where you want your money to go, and you can click Middle East there. If you would just want to support the Real News, please feel free to do that. And after watching one of Lia's pieces of work, we are going to be joined by a panel who are all of them expert level. Many of them have been guests at the Real News, and they're going to engage with Lia in discussing about the current situation in Palestine, Israel, and in the Middle East. So please join us on the Real News Network, and please help us in our $200,000 2011 matching campaign. And as I said, here's an example of one of Lia's recent stories.
On Friday, thousands of Israelis marched through Tel Aviv to mark International Human Rights Day.
Human rights right now! Human rights right now! Human rights right now! Human rights right now!
Various groups fighting for human rights in Israel came together in this march. They included African refugees, right-wing communities, and the global Occupy movement. The march was organized to protest a wave of laws right-wing and religious parties are currently passing through parliament. The Association for Civil Rights in Israel called this collection of laws anti-democratic. Lia Tarachansky is their Director of International Relations.
And by anti-democratic, we're basically looking at 4 categories of legislative initiatives that are coming up at various speeds and with various fervor in our Knesset. The first is a whole slew of legislation aimed at limiting the rights of the Arab minority in Israel. And these are a spate of legislation that call into question various things like loyalty. The second trend that we see are a group of legislative bills and now some laws which aim to limit the ability for civil society to operate, specifically targeting human rights NGOs and political NGOs that don't tote the party line, as it were. The third re-arising trend are a group of initiatives aimed at the High Court of Justice. And then the fourth is direct freedom of expression limitations, both aimed at the press and again at civil society. So things like the most recent amendment to the libel law. And for us, the most worrying thing about some of these trends is that they create a serious chilling effect where people who aim to voice important criticism of Israeli government policy have to think twice before they do so.
In preparation for Human Rights Day, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recorded a special address, claiming Israel is a model of human rights in the region. Specifically, Netanyahu outlined the right to protest, comparing the social justice movement of the summer to the Arab Spring.
We're proud to be a country that is governed by laws, not men, where protests in town squares is a way of life. It's not a sign of revolution. People go to the squares, they give voice to whatever protests and grievances they have. They do it on the internet, they do it in the newspapers, they do it on television, they do it in our parliament, the Knesset, in a robust, dynamic, and free way that is an example for the entire democratic world.
While the Human Rights March was held in Tel Aviv, an hour away in the West Bank, dozens of Palestinian villages were holding their weekly nonviolent demonstrations. In Abi Saleh, the protest ended when 3 demonstrators sustained serious injuries. Mustafa Tamimi is a 28-year-old resident of the village. He was shot at close range with a high-velocity tear gas canister by a soldier from a military jeep. The army then delayed the ambulance, and Tamimi died from his injuries the next day. According to the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, he's the 20th protester since 2004 to be killed by Israeli soldiers in such protests.
It's important when talking about the freedoms that the J14 movement experienced throughout the summer to point out that at that same time and for years before this and continuously until today, Palestinians in the West Bank are not given that same right to protest. Palestinians living in the West Bank are subject to Israeli military law. They're not tried in the same legal system as Israelis, the civilian courts inside Israel. Military Order 101 creates a situation, or states fully, that any gathering of Palestinians of above 10 people or more, needs to require a special permit, needs to obtain a special permit from the occupying power, from the Israeli authorities. The backdrop of those protests is that Palestinians are protesting against the occupation. They're not going to request a permit from the occupier in order to do those protests. So ostensibly, Military Order 101 creates a situation in which every protest in the occupied territories of Palestinians is illegal.
Military Order 101 forbids displaying the Palestinian flag, printing of political posters, and bans the gathering of more than 10 people for a political purpose or for a matter that may be construed as political.
Often people's freedom of movement is limited as a means for blocking protests from occurring. So either by putting into place closed military zones around the specific areas that protests are taking place, or simply blocking cars from arriving at the protest site. Another way is through excessive use of force in crowd dispersal. Often protests which haven't even started yet are already dispersed. The villages of Bilin and Nialin were declared closed military zones semi-permanently every Friday from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So it's clear that that's being used in order to limit the possibility of protests from happening. We see a lot of misuse of weapons. For example, shooting projectile tear gas canisters directly at protesters instead of in an arc fashion, which is how they're meant to be used. And then another topic is a whole system of arrests, both that take place during the protests, where whoever is standing near the soldiers could potentially be arrested, and often it's youth that are involved in stone throwing or other parts of the protest, but also night arrests that happen during the night in various Palestinian villages, where Israeli military or security forces will go into a village and arrest people that are suspected of being part of protests. So you can see direct campaigns in particular villages of arresting the protest leaders.
The difference between the Israeli and Palestinian right to protest was especially evident during the summer social justice movement, known as the July 14th or the Israeli summer. While many were arrested, not a single protest was met with tear gas, stun grenades, rubber or live ammunition, as is common in the West Bank. Even during Mustafa Tamimi's funeral on Sunday, the army again invaded the village and showered the mourners with tear gas and skunk, a fluid that smells like sewage and is shot from a water cannon truck. 3 people were injured and 8 arrested. The Tel Aviv march was also challenged by nationalist and settler organizations, waving Israeli flags and singing the national anthem. Hanin Zouabi is a member of the Israeli parliament. Her parliamentary privileges were revoked because she participated in the Freedom Flotilla humanitarian aid convoy to Gaza in 2010.
אז הגזענות לא התחילה לפני שנתיים, היא לא התחילה רק דרך ממשלתו של נתניהו. הגזענות נגד הערבים, עשרות חוקים בעד הפקעת אדמות שלא מכירות בפלסטיני כיליד של המולדת הזאת, זה גם השמאל בישראל. כאשר אנחנו אומרים אנחנו נלחמים בגזענות, כל התפיסה הזאת של מדינה אקסקלוסיבית ליהודים היא הבסיס לגזענות. ההתעוררות הזאת היא התעוררות חלקית, ואני חושבת שהיא לא יכולה, עד עכשיו, היא לא יכולה להציג אלטרנטיבה חזקה ואמיתית לגזענות.
In a form of political satire, anti-racist protesters dressed up as the KKK, as politicians and tycoons. For The Real News, I'm Lia Tarachansky in Tel Aviv.
Welcome back to the Real News Network. As you probably know by now, we are in the midst of our $200,000 challenge. We have a $100,000 matching grant, and if you donate $1 now, that dollar will be matched. And your donation makes work like the work of Lia Tarachansky's possible. She couldn't be doing what she's doing in Israel and Palestine without your financial support. So without further ado, we're back to Lia. Lia, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me back, Paul.
And we're also now joined by quite an illustrious panel of Real News viewers and supporters, but who virtually practically maybe everybody on the panel could be a guest in their own right. So we thank you all for joining us. And starting off now is Shir Hever. We've interviewed Shir many times on the Real News. But Shir, what's a question you've always wanted to ask Lia? And given how much you know about all this, don't be afraid to ask a long question.
I guess I would like to ask Lia, are you ever concerned that when you collect the kind of information that you collect and show the kind of videos that you show and ask the tough questions that you ask to the Israeli officials, is there a risk that you will be cut off from these official channels? And have you ever felt that you have to compromise on the kind of questions you want to ask in order to avoid alienating the official spokespeople for the Israeli army or for the Israeli government?
It's actually very interesting because access to journalists here in Israel is very limited. For example, in 2007, the government press office has severely changed the ability to get a GPO card, a government press office card. And the new director actually cut the number of GPO cards in half. And what we see now is that when new journalists come into the scene, they get vetted not only by the government's press office, but also by the Israeli Internal Intelligence Agency. So there's a lot more process that happens between joining the journalist community in Israel and actually having access. But in terms of danger, I think that the possibility of a potential danger coming from the questions that I ask to these people is maybe a speculative point. What we do have in Israel right now is a very alarming set of rules, laws that are currently going through Parliament and getting slowly approved in one version or another. And these are laws that are actually very anti-freedom of speech laws and very anti-opposition, very anti-dissent.
What's an example of one of those laws?
For example, one of the laws that I'm sure Ronnie Barkan, who's here joining us today, can talk about is the Boycott Law and how people who call for or support the international call for boycott on Israel get persecuted. Right now, these days, the Parliament is discussing how to pass a law that will make most human rights organizations in Israel's funding dry up. So by restricting their ability to get international funding, which is where most human rights groups in Israel get their funding. So rules like that. So the Association for Civil Rights in Israel has made a whole list of these rules, and these are actually a lot more restricting than the potentiality of being cut off from access. But maybe Roni, maybe you wanted to talk a little bit about that yourself.
So let me just introduce Ronnie. Ronnie Barkan teaches in Tel Aviv. Go ahead, Ron.
About the anti-boycott law, it was drafted as such a draconian law that they had to revise it several times. Initially, they actually wanted it to be put in place 1 year retroactively, and they still kept, and they understood that this would have to be changed because it simply doesn't look good. They did keep in place other things, for example, that there is no need to prove damages for the plaintiff. So there was such repercussion for legislating this law. This law has been legislated last July, and there has been such a repercussion that the most mainstream, the most even ardent Zionist groups around the world were expressing their dissatisfaction with this law because it really makes Israel look bad, and actually reveals the true face of what is happening here, which is far from being democratic, but rather something that tries to maintain Jewish majority at any cost.
Bob Naiman is Policy Director at Just Foreign Policy. Bob, do you have a comment and a question for Lia?
I have a question on a related but different topic, and that is this. What do you think, what's your view in this period of the responsibilities or role of journalism, particularly alternative journalism, with respect to nonviolent protest against the occupation, particularly in the West Bank? I'm thinking about the fact that, this, as you know, there's this history of commentary, like people like Nicholas Kristof, saying where is the Palestinian nonviolent movement, and yet the same people, when there is nonviolent resistance and leaders of this resistance are jailed or beaten, we don't see these writers using their venues to publicize these cases. And we see instead the kind of, if it bleeds, it leads approach of journalism to the conflict. All the report on violence, not so much attention to the protests of civil society. So I'm wondering what your view is of that in general, and then how do you as a journalist try to address these concerns?
Go ahead, Lia.
I think that it's very important to note that these things are happening as we speak, and are a weekly, a daily reality in the West Bank. I think that the responsibility of journalists is to listen to these voices, to understand these voices, to report about their unique struggles and their collective struggles together. I think that our inability to enter Gaza severely limits our, the coverage that we can provide of the same sort of nonviolent protests happening in Gaza. I think that many alternative journalists have covered the nonviolent resistance in the Palestinian territories. But one thing that I learned here is that actually the story on the 16th page is a lot more important than the story on the front page. And what you find in these stories is the details, and the details are really what matters. And I think that one of the privileges of working at the Real News is that I get to cover those details such as the development of court cases against nonviolent activists and the sort of legal weapons that the occupation uses against these people. And it also gives you a window into covering the occupation at large. Things like, for example, the last story I did was about segregation rows. And it was a very, I think, telling example of journalism in the Middle East, because when I went to the event itself, just to shortly summarize, Palestinian activists, nonviolent activists here, held an action shortly after the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Riders in the United States, basically drawing the comparison that segregation in the West Bank is very similar to segregation in the American South during the Jim Crow laws. And when I went to the press conference that was happening before the action, and the action itself constituted activists boarding segregated buses in the West Bank, there are Israeli settler buses, to sort of challenge the segregation in the West Bank. The press conference was, there were more journalists than I have ever seen in my life at a nonviolent event, nonviolent resistance protest event. And there was 6 activists, and there was maybe 40 video cameras and photographers and other journalists. And, they followed this action from beginning to end. And when I was reviewing the coverage of the action, there was a lot of talk about violence, resistance of other Palestinians in the past. There was a lot of criticism of terrorism. There was a lot of talk about whether it's actually a valid sort of action to take and whether it's a provocation. But not a single media actually looked at the segregation that takes place in the West Bank because of which these activists did their action. And I think that really it sort of summarizes what you're up against as a journalist here, is that, stories are literally just lying on the street waiting to be reported, and yet what you get is basically a sort of herd mentality with journalists.
Leah, but Bob's point, I guess, is that there's nonviolent actions taking place almost all the time, marches to the wall, and there's been a lot of this kind of activity, maybe not as much as some people would like to see. But in terms of mainstream news coverage, it's still, if it bleeds, it leads. It kind of strengthens the argument that if you want to get any real global attention, you got to do something violently.
Or you got to do something new, or you got to do something different. I don't think that it strengthens the point that you have to do something violently, because, like I said, the Freedom Riders action saw more journalists than I've seen in violent protests in the West Bank. So I think that the way that the media works, unfortunately, is if you want attention, you have to do something different, you have to do something new, or you have to do something violent. And these people have found the optimum in nonviolent action that was different and new. And as a journalist, I mean, of course, I mean, it's not, you can't report the exact same thing again and again. You have to find different ways to get into it.
Yeah, but I think what's great about your work, Leah, is that you're following sort of all the efforts of people to resist, and giving us a sense of the voices of people that are looking at innovative ways and trying to organize an independent movement in Palestine. Sama Sabawi joins us. She's coming in from Melbourne, Australia. She's a Palestinian writer and commentator. Sama, do you want to make a comment, ask a question?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on this show. And Leah, I've been following your coverage since you began. I think it was about 2 years ago that you started. I loved the report on Freedom Riders. I watched it. I found that it was very comprehensive. You really did explain what the segregation was in ways that no other media outlet did at the time. I love the way you had the picture of Rosa Parks in your report, and you really brought us to the civil rights movement in the U.S., and you really connected the dots very well. But I did notice something which brings me to my question here. You were referring to the segregation wall, and we all know that language is a tricky thing when we're talking about the Middle East conflict and when we're talking about Israel and Palestine. Some people would call it the security barrier, fence, the apartheid wall. So I wanted to know how you choose your language. Is there a policy that you work within? Is there limitations to what kind of language you use? And that's really the first part of the question. And the second part has to do with how long you've been there. And I want to know if you feel that your choice of stories have been affected by the length of time that you've spent there, as well as your language by the length of time that you've spent covering the events over there.
Yeah, it's a good question. Go ahead, Leah.
Just a quick point on the first question. This actually comes up a lot. I do get this question a lot. How do I choose the terminology? And I try to, as much as possible in the terminology, to adhere to international law, using the language of the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. For the segregation wall, I chose the term segregation because I think that it best describes what the point of the wall is. But to address your second question about whether the length of the time here affects the kind of stories I choose, definitely, absolutely. And I think that over time, I've been working with the Real News for just over 3 years, and here in the Middle East for 2 of those. And as much as you feel that you sort of understand what's happening here, every day you wake up and you realize that you really don't. And I try to get as much as possible with time to covering stories that try as simply as possible to lay out what is actually happening in a way that an international audience can relate to. And the questions that I ask are evolving to more the human questions, I hope. So that's sort of the hope. But Sama, you've been of great assistance to me in your political analysis. In the 2 years that I've been here, have you seen a substantial change in what's happening on the ground that you think that journalists are sort of losing?
I think the international media has has been very guilty of really ignoring the growth of the nonviolent movement. And this is something we were talking about earlier on as well. There is a substantial nonviolent movement. It has grown to a point where it has become the liberation movement for the Palestinians. And it seems that the international media hasn't really caught up on trying to understand or explain or put the spotlight on this movement. And nonviolence only works if we pay it attention and if we give it strength. And I just feel that journalists in the international media have not given it the strength that they need to give it and the backing that they need to give it. I've also noticed that people are still very stuck on the peace process and the two-state solution, while totally ignoring the realities that are unfolding on the ground. And really the frustration for me comes from having to hear these same kinds of lines that the governments throw around, especially the Australian, the Canadian government. We support a two-state solution, and then they come short of saying anything about settlements, which have grown substantially. So there is a disconnect really between the analysis that we're getting in our daily newspapers and the journalists' reports that we're getting and what's actually happening on the ground. And I think this is where the real news really fills a niche that other reports have really failed to fill.
Thank you. Peter Larson joins us from Canada. Are you in Ottawa, Peter? Peter is with the National Council on Canadian-Arab Relations.
Yes, I am, Paul. I'm here in the frozen north.
So do you have a comment or question for Lia?
The question perhaps to both of you, and it relates to what you decide to cover at the Real News Network. I find that as I talk to Canadians about the Palestine issue in particular, those that have some understanding of it really have a bit of an understanding about the occupation. They don't really have much of an understanding of the situation of the Palestinians in 48 Israel, or for that matter, about the refugee camps, a little bit about Gaza. So I'm wondering, it seems to me that your coverage is heavy on the occupied territories and less on the concrete situations of Palestinians in Israel. I haven't seen everything, so perhaps Lia can tell me that that's not right. And the second thing that I find that I would like to see more of that would be helpful to me is more information about what's happening in the United States, Europe, and Canada. Not just the high-profile things like Helen Thomas, but what's happening in the Episcopalian Church, or who are sending visits there, or what's happening in other kind of organizations. I think that, frankly, we spend a lot of time focused on what's happening over there, but not enough on what's happening here. And I think there is a lot going on.
Lia is posted over there, so I mean, maybe I can try to answer about over here, but why don't you start with this question of our emphasis has been more on the occupied territories than on what's going on within the borders of 48 Israel.
And I think that that's true. We have been focusing more on the occupation, and over time, we're actually starting to focus more and more on the plight of Palestinians inside Israel. But I think that the intention is not to sort of look at these things as separate issues, but extensions of each other. And the policies that began before 48, during 48, and later on increased after 67 are more or less the same policies that were enacted more or less by the same people. And the more that we look into what their effect is inside the West Bank and Gaza, the more that we can understand what has happened also in Israel. On the question of how we choose stories, I think Paul, as our editor, could probably answer that a lot better than I could.
Well, it depends which stories we're talking about. I mean, our main issue is one of resources. I mean, right now, the work that we do, the primary audience for what Lia is doing is in North America and Europe and Australia. We are planning to open up new sections of the website, both in Arabic and in Hebrew, so that what we're doing can be seen there. And we also have a new correspondent joined us, Jahan Haifas, who's going to be full-time from Cairo. So that's also going to be part of our coverage in Arabic and Hebrew. But I think it's something we should pay more attention to, what's going on inside Israel. These struggles that broke out over the summer with the big massive demonstrations, we covered quite a bit, and there was some sections of those demonstrations that seemed to take up this chant about if you know, economic justice for Israelis includes economic justice for Palestinians, both in Israel and in the occupied territories. I think it's actually a good suggestion that we should do more. Why don't you suggest a storyline for us?
Well, actually, I think, for example, the situation of Christians in Israel is an interesting one. It's a way to broaden, I think, the Real News Network's audience. We don't have to be doing stories that are aimed at people who are leftists on every question. I think there are ways of getting at the story that actually will be appealing to a broader audience.
We will take that into consideration, as they say, but we will do something about it. Although I must say, I think the audience for what's going on in Israel and Palestine and criticism of what these Israeli policies are goes far beyond the left. A lot of our audience is not leftist. I think if you look at some of the comments and emails, so it's quite a broad spectrum that watch the Real News. But in that broad spectrum, you will find a lot of people who do not accept the occupation. Shir, why don't you pick up with another question? I don't know if everyone's seen our interviews with Shir, however, but if you haven't, you really should. He's we think one of the leading experts on the political economy of Israel and the occupation. Shir, how about an economic question from you and maybe a comment?
Well, to tie it back to what Lia said before about the clampdown on the Israeli, on the press coverage and the limitation imposed on journalists, there's also an interesting economic angle to this. Just a few days ago, there was an emergency conference in Tel Aviv about the new laws, the new policies by the Israeli government to silence the free press. And something quite surprising came out of this conference, actually, and that was that not most, but many journalists hinted or said outright that the biggest obstacle to their work is not government censorship, but economic censorship. Because all the main media channels are owned by capital owners, by very large corporations in Israel, they cannot report on these corporations. And because the journalists, if ever they'll need to change their workplace, they'll have to work for one of the other corporations, they can't really report on the other corporations. And what I would like to ask is, have you ever encountered a story that was not covered by the Israeli mainstream media, but you could cover it because the Real News is not funded by corporations and is not does not belong to any of the capital owners, and did that give you more freedom in covering these stories?
I think a perfect example is an investigation I've been working on for about 7 months for a story that I haven't published yet, which is about the up-and-coming Israeli oil industry. And I don't know if you've heard, but in the past two years, there's been a company here in Israel that received a permit and is currently working on exploration projects in the heart of Israel, in one of the most luscious agricultural areas by Bet Shemesh, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And they're a company that's owned by IDT Corporation, which is one of the biggest investment firms in Israel, and it is one of the biggest telecommunications corporations and owns quite a bit of the media. So for reasons that are beyond me, the Israeli media, except for the financial press, has completely ignored the story that this company's work, which by the end of the decade will enter a form of commercial phase, will put Israel on the map in terms of oil production, because the numbers, even the most conservative numbers that they're talking about, put Israel on par with the Saudi Arabian oil industry. And the only company that's currently received a permit to actually getting at the oil shale, which is a poor quality form of oil, is owned by IDT. And when I was scouting the Israeli press about this, the only thing I could find were 2 articles by Channel 10 and the financial press, more or less, talking about how fantastic this will be for the Israeli, energy independence. There was no investigation into who are the people funding this, which, just on a side note, people like Rupert Murdoch, Dick Cheney, and Lord Jacob Rothschild. There's no talk about the environmental effects of this technology, which is very experimental and has only been used in the Canadian tar sands. There was no talk about the effect it would have on the local residents, etc. And I think that what you're talking about in terms of self-censorship has a lot to do with it, and corporate censorship as well. But a story that we actually did review 2 years ago about the move in the Israeli security establishment to make the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories as remote control as possible is another great example. Maybe you can talk about that.
I think one of the interesting developments in the Israeli policies of occupation is to try to use neoliberal methods of outsourcing and privatization in order to try to take the responsibility for the occupied Palestinian population off the shoulders of the Israeli government as much as possible. Actually, all of the permanent checkpoints in the West Bank have been privatized already, and they are now staffed by private security guards and operated by private companies, which creates some very problematic situations, because the legal framework for when private security guards uses the weapon to shoot and kill a Palestinian is not completely clear. But it's not just that, it also has an international dimension. And the international community is willing to take some of the cost of the occupation on its own shoulders, and to take a responsibility for basic services to the Palestinian population on itself, especially European donors, rather than demand that Israel meet its own obligations. And these large corporations that are gaining a larger share of the market for security and for management of population are gradually becoming one of the most significant exports of the Israeli economy. And it is something that I think viewers of the Real News from all over the world should be interested in, because it influences the lives and the issues of privacy and civil rights in every country in the world that buys these services from these Israeli and international corporations that are using their technology in Palestine. And that's something that's already happening in airports, in police forces all around the world.
Well, maybe just to wind things up, I'd like to ask each of the panel members, we'll pick it up with Bob Naiman, just a little bit of your assessment of how the rest of the media covers Palestine and Israel, and what you would like to see more from the Real News, or what do you think people need to know that we should strengthen our coverage?
Well, in terms of the mainstream media in the United States, there's just so little in terms of reporting on what's happening to people, which is it's just very episodic. In terms of what I would like to see more, I'm very interested in Peter's suggestion about reporting more on what's happening elsewhere, what's happening in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, around the world, the countries that support the occupation, and efforts of people to mobilize against it and take this mainstream. Peter mentioned what's happening with the churches, and interested in the idea of connecting these two things. So, for example, somebody mentioned earlier the boycott movements, arguably the most prominent one now in the United States is the boycott Haba movement, the Dead Sea Cosmetics, pointing out that these come from an illegal Israeli settlement in the West Bank. So maybe that's a story where one side of the story is investigating this settlement, and what's going on there. And the other side of the story is talking about the organizing efforts in the United States and also maybe Caterpillar. That could be another story. And certainly there are others. But that might be, these kinds of stories might give an opportunity to connect the two things.
Good. Sama, what would you like to see more from us? More from, well, if you were on Lia's editorial committee, what would you assign her?
I recently was doing a presentation on the environmental impact of the occupation, and I noticed just how little there was out there on that. Listening to Shir speaking earlier about the economic occupation of the Palestinian people, I would really like to see some in-depth look at the different industrial zones and the impact that these industrial zones in the occupied territories are having on the lives of the Palestinians and are having, generally speaking, on supporting the occupation and the settlement project. So I think that's one area that we don't have enough information about.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to assign her?
I actually had a question, but is it too late?
Yeah, no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I had a question for Lia because I was very curious. I remember seeing a while back a piece that you did on militarism. I think it was called Selling It Like Toothpaste. I don't know if you remember the piece I'm talking about, but it was a very disturbing piece about how militarism is being sold to children at a very, very young age through the television program where they have the soldier come in and the conversation that ensues from that. And when I saw that piece, I wondered, your pieces and the media reports in general, they serve two purposes. They educate the people on the outside about what's happening in different parts of the world, but they're also some kind of a self-reflection sometimes for people who live in these thoughts. So for Israelis, how many Israelis watch your reports, and how many would see this type of reporting as self-analysis or worthwhile, self-criticism? I mean, I just want to really know how many Israelis benefit from watching your reports and actually give you feedback on them.
I think that Paul would probably be more versed on the actual numbers. What I noticed was that in the past few years when I've been here, because we were the first sort of international, we were the first foreign press to cover the social protest movement. That got picked up in the Israeli blogosphere and also in the Israeli social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And what I found was over the months since the movement began in July till now, more and more and more people recognize, name the real news, and they watch it, and they have questions and suggestions, etc. So it's definitely grown here in Israel, and we are currently collaborating with one independent media that's also based in Tel Aviv called Untitled 70, which is their main focus is social issues inside Israel. But as far as the story itself, selling Israeli militarism like toothpaste, the incredible thing about something that seems so obvious from the outside is that it's almost invisible from inside. And even though I grew up in Israel, I didn't really pay attention to the fact that our society is in fact extremely militarized. And it wasn't until I came back here many years later and noticed that, my little cousins are learning to count in kindergarten with pictures of tanks and soldiers and F-16s, that it became obvious how militarized the society really is, for a million reasons. So I think that when the same information is represented to you, even if you are inside of all of this, I think that it does have an effect, and I hope that when we do grow, we are able to target the Israeli audience a lot more by having Hebrew and Arabic coverage.
Well, let me jump in. One of the things that will help us, first of all, we need help. This is a fundraising campaign, so if you're watching this, we need you to help donate to support Lia's work. But if there's someone out there that would like to make a particular donation of a little bit of size, a few $1,000s maybe, one of the things we would do is start buying some advertising in Israeli press. So we'll launch the Hebrew website, And then we'll do some advertising, because I don't think you can have much impact unless we do some marketing there. But that's certainly within our plans. Ronnie, a quick suggestion or direction for what you would like to see more from On the Real News.
Yes, carrying on from what has just been discussed about self-censorship, about the psyche of Israeli society, and also about the very heavy ties between Israel and Western powers, be it the US, Canada, and also the EU, for that matter. I would like to assign Lia, or to ask her, two questions relating to that. One is, I was just watching today Cindy Corey, the mother of late Rachel Corey, reading from her letter, reading from Gaza. And Rachel talks about how the 8-year-old children in Gaza know much more about American politics than what she knew as a grown-up coming and growing in the US. And I would like to know, how can we change that? And I think that the Real News has a very big potential in doing that, because it does not apply self-censorship, and it can do in-depth research that other media outlets probably cannot. And I would like to ask Lia, how does she see educating the Western world about their complicity and about their relationship to what is happening in Gaza? Because the children in Gaza, they know very well. This is the first question.
Yeah.
The second one would be about, since everything is so intertwined, and we know how Israel is very much related to all these powers, and we also see what is happening in the world right now, that the struggles have become global struggles. The BDS campaign, we know about that. That is a Palestinian-led global struggle, which is a very successful one and is growing by the day. And we see what is happening in the Arab world and so on. And I would like to know how the Real News can actually do this. How can it actually globalize the media coverage about these issues?
Well, we'll take up all those questions. And okay, Peter, we'll give you the final word. You opened up the question of how Real News can do a better job. What else would you like to see in terms of our work?
Well, Paul, what I don't know, and maybe you can think about, is I don't know how well you know what your readers or viewers do with your work. How do they use it? I use your stuff in 3 ways. I use it partly for my own information. Certain clips I can send on to friends, and some I can incorporate into presentations. I do quite a few presentations around town on the Israel-Palestine issue. I'd be interesting to see how people use your stuff and how we can make it more usable. I have some suggestions, but I won't go into it now. But I think I don't know the extent to which you do customer surveys, but I think that would be a useful thing to do if you're not doing it.
Yeah, we do surveys, but that's a good question, because I don't think we've ever asked that, and it's a great question. And we know a lot of our work's used in schools, and we get a lot of email from teachers who start classes with one of our reports, and then they go into a class discussion about it. But I think this is a great question. So we will do this survey, and maybe we'll even open up a section of the website, a page, which is just about this, how to use Real News and how we can make our stuff more usable for viewers. So I want to thank everybody on this panel. It's a great panel. In fact, this is a panel we will get back together again. Thank you to Lia for the tremendous work you do. And thank you to you for watching. We need your support. The reason we can do work like Lia's in the Middle East and Israel and do these remarkable reports, like, for example, on human rights in Israel and the cost of who benefits from the occupation. These are topics which everyone knows are considered rather taboo in most of mainstream media. The reason we can do these kinds of reports so independently, based on facts, and without bending to any kind of pressure, is because you donate. It's you that makes this possible. So we need your support. If you haven't donated yet this year, or you'd like to donate again to specifically support the work of Lia in Israel and Palestine, please click this donate button, or give us a call, or send us a check. And thank you again. Remember, every dollar you donate before the end of the year will be matched by our matching donor grant. So this is a particularly important time to click donate. Thanks for joining us on the Real News Network.